Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in this part of our world. We welcome to our webinar, which is entitled, actually the main theme is the 1896 Battle of Adwa in Ethiopia, Insights on Africa's Contemporary Challenges. The Battle of Adwa was a significant moment in Ethiopian history, and it marked the country's successful resistance against European colonialism and imperial expansion. It was also a defining moment for Africa as a whole, and it demonstrated that African countries were capable of defending their sovereignty and independence, as well as against colonial powers and imperialism. The victory at Adwa had several important implications for Ethiopia. First, it solidified Ethiopia's independence, ensuring that the country remained one of the few African countries that were not colonized by European powers, or the only in the sub-Saharan. The independence allowed Ethiopia to develop its own political, economic, and cultural institutions and maintain its unique identity. It created a sense of national pride and unity among Ethiopians. The victory of Adwa had a broader impact on Africa as well. It inspired other African countries to resist colonial rule and to fight for their independence. Thus, the battle was a symbol for African resistance against colonialism, and it demonstrated that Africa was not just a passive victim of imperialism, and also, but a continent with a rich culture and identity. So the legacy of Adwa continues to inspire Ethiopians and Africans today. The victory is celebrated as a moment of national and continental pride and has become a symbol for African resistance against oppression, imperialism, and colonialism. The battle demonstrated that African countries could defend their sovereignty, independence, and it inspired future generations to fight for their rights and dignity. Its legacy continues to inspire not only Ethiopia, but Africa as a whole. But of great interest today to us is not retelling the battle story, but rather to answer the question, what is the significance of, more specifically, the victory of Ethiopians over the Italians, for what's its implications and what is its significance for present and future Ethiopia, indeed for Africa and the African descendants in the diaspora? That's the question. And to assist us untangle some thorny issues that come with answers to this question, we have a great panel today here with us, which I'll be introducing to us presently. But for detailed information on their biographies, please visit the chat box. Now turning to introducing our great panelists here, and who actually are going to speak according to, I will introduce all of them. And then after that, they'll take turns following the way they are introduced. That's the sequence that is going to be followed. The speakers have given me the privilege of calling them by their first name, which really makes them more close to us. The first person I'll introduce, starting from the left, with some headsets, I think that's going to be easy to say, is Milton. Milton is an assistant professor of journalism and graduate school of journalism at Columbia University, and an adjunct professor of history at John Jay College of the City University of New York. And the next to welcome Milton. And next to Milton is Mohammed. Mohammed is the national chair of the United African Congress and served as a chief of geriatrist at the State University of New York, Downstate Medical Center in Brooklyn, until his retirement as an associate professor of medicine, and now emeritus. And then we have Sabine. Sabine is an assistant professor in anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. She is a political, urban, and economic anthropologist. And then the last person to be introduced, who is joining us shortly, is Professor Georges. And he's a professor of African and Global Studies at the University of North Carolina. With that introduction, I will ask Milton to take it away and speak for about 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. I welcome everybody who's listening or watching us today as we discuss the significance of the Battle of Adwa. I call it a great victory on behalf of the entire African continent and the African diaspora as well, not just an Ethiopian victory. Because if we look at it logically, the maps in the African continent were drawn by European colonizers anyway. So if we see Africa as a United States of Africa, which is our ultimate hope, then that is even the reason more why it counts as an African victory against imperialism. And as you noted, Professor Sibanda, we are not here to really rehash that story. We want to put it in some context and show the relevance of that victory. Africans are familiar with European history, whether we talk about Europeans in Europe or Europeans in what is now the United States of America. Africans know about the Battle of Gettysburg. Africans know about Waterloo. Africans know about the Battle of Britain. Africans know about the Normandy landing. And there's a reason why they know of these battles, because the conquerors teach about those battles and those great victories, their victories, not our victories as African people. We don't know our history. We don't know our victories. We don't know who our heroes are. And in studying the history of demonization of African peoples from a young age, not only did I critique the distortion of Africans in the way Africans were referred to historically in European literature, the tribalization of Africa, the demonization of Africans. And then, of course, I found missing the history of Africa's victories. So it conveys a sense of African complicity in their colonization and subjugation, African docility, as if Africans welcome colonization, domination, and subjugation. And that, unfortunately, is the impression that most Europeans have of Africans. And sadly, that is also the impression that many Africans have of themselves. So I made it my point in my work in journalism, not only to counter the language of demonization, but also to insist on telling the missing histories of Africa. And that, of course, including the history of resistance against colonial conquest. So, for example, many Africans are unaware of the Battle of Isandlwana, when the Zulu defeated the British Army under General Chelmsford in 1879 and destroyed 1,600 British imperialist soldiers. Many Africans are unaware of the Mahdist victory in 1885 over General Gordon of Britain. Many Africans are unaware of the Battle of Adwa. And of course, the Battle of Adwa was one of the most significant of all these victories against imperialism. And as you noted, Ethiopia ended up being the only African country not conquered during the scramble for Africa during the last 20 years of the 19th century. So that is why I decided to focus on the Battle of Adwa. I also did it for a number of reasons. I wanted to give Empress Taytu her just dues, because often in the history of telling Africa's history, we do not give the appropriate recognition to women in our narratives and in our history. And in the case of Ethiopia and the Battle of Adwa, the Empress played a very prominent role on occasions when the emperor himself, Menelik II, seemed to be more accommodating. She was much more rigid and much more firm, and was less trusting of the European imperialists who were conquering Africa and also attempted to conquer Ethiopia. And then, of course, I wanted to explode the myth that Africans did not have any significant victories against imperialism. I wanted to dispel inferiority complexes that develop as a result of centuries of demonization passed on from one generation to the next. I find that it empowers people. Our knowledge of history empowers people. I see that with my students at John Jay College. At the end of each semester, my students are completely transformed once they become familiar with the missing history. And that was another one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on the Battle of Adwa. I wanted it to become much more accessible to a younger generation. And that is why my book, Adwa, Empress Taytu and Emperor Menelik in Love and War, was produced as a graphic book with illustrations, which I find that young people like, but mature readers also enjoy it. And that was one of the reasons I produced it as a dramatized history with illustration. And when I say dramatized, I mean that I created conversation between the principal characters in this story: the emperor, the Italians who came to conquer, and the Empress. So I created a conversation, a narrative, just to breathe some life into the story while maintaining the accuracy of the historical facts. And of course, one of the most interesting aspects was that the main reason for the battle was that the Italians had deceived the Ethiopians when they signed a treaty in 1889, the Treaty of Wuchale. And it turns out that chapter 17 was very deceptive. The Amharic version referred to Ethiopia being able of having the option of using Italy as an intermediary in their dealings with other European powers. But the Italian version gave no such option and essentially turned Ethiopia into a colony of Italy. And when the Ethiopians discovered this, obviously, there was no other option but to resolve it on the battlefield. And finally, let me address the other aspect of the theme of today's presentation, the contemporary challenges that Africa faces when we see several conflicts in a number of African countries, including Ethiopia itself. And now we see Sudan. And before that, we had South Sudan. We have Cameroon and other areas of conflict on the African continent. I think that the Battle of Adwa, which brought together many otherwise conflicting nationalities in Ethiopia itself, to unite, to resist, to fight and defeat one common enemy, was the best demonstration to me of the importance and the benefit and the power of uniting. After all, collectively as African people, we face a common enemy, which is the domination of Africa by advanced capitalism from industrialized countries. We cannot counter that as individual African countries. We must take the lesson from Adwa, when Ethiopians came together collectively, and we must come together collectively as African people and disregard those often meaningless borders, which we had no role in drawing in the first place. So I would like to end on that note. The Battle of Adwa should teach us the benefits of seeing ourselves as a united African people. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, Mohammed, if you may take it away.
Okay. Greetings, everyone. I'm calling from Ethiopia, Addis Ababa at the moment. And I'll take off where Milton left off, talking about the significance of the Battle of Adwa. And that is the unity of peoples, whether people of Ethiopia or the many nations of Africa together. The significance is that the people from all corners of Ethiopia, all ethnic groups, nations and nationalities came together, sending Adwa, heeding the call of Emperor Menelik to face an invading army, colonizing army from Italy. And that, I think, is the significance that everyone, regardless of their ethnicity, came together to defend Ethiopia's independence. That has been the story of Ethiopia in general throughout its millennia-old history. But the current day of situation, as mentioned, as Milton alluded to briefly, has become so polarized such that even the unifying motif that was the Battle of Adwa for Ethiopians has itself become a point of contention around the narrative, who owns the narrative of Adwa. For me, the Battle of Adwa is the victory of the people of Ethiopia who came together. Due credit should be given to the Emperor Menelik, who mobilized the people, but it's not a history of the emperor or of some of the princes and dukes that participated in it. It's the people. And in addition to the men that fought in the battle, I think Milton's book, focusing on the role of Empress Taytu, is particularly important because she did play, indeed, a very important role, commanding her own contingent of fighters herself, but also having thousands of other women tending to the wounded, basically the nursing, basically, as in war times, was something that Taytu, perhaps, maybe among the early pioneers in organizing that. The Battle of Adwa was not the first victory of Africans over invading, colonizing powers. Milton mentioned the case of the Zulus under Shaka that inflicted immense amount of casualties of the invading British on several battles. There was also the case of Muhammad Al-Mahdi to the north and west of Ethiopia in the Sudan, who rose up against the colonizing British Anglo-Egyptian co-dominion to free Sudan. And in the final battle of Khartoum, actually ended up killing the governor, General Pasha, and defeating the British, thereby, at least for a brief moment, though it might have been, establish independence for Sudan. So that's not the first, but the thing about Adwa is the fact that people united from all corners can come together and defeat a much superior modern army, provided they are united. And that is true of for Africa. Instead of 54 fragmented countries, had we heeded the call of Kwame Nkrumah in the early days of independence to unite, he even had a vision of an African unified command for the continent. We wouldn't have been in the situation we are in right now. So the significance is really about the stress on unity. Before the Battle of Adwa, one of Ethiopia's and also Africa's perhaps ablest generals, Ras Alula, had inflicted a crushing defeat on the Italians at the Battle of Dogali some 9 years earlier, before the Battle of Adwa. So the Italians know of him and know what to expect of Ethiopians when they try to invade. This was actually a smaller contingent of 500 people of Italian troops that were completely decimated, leaving only 8 wounded who survived. So that's the first really victory of Ethiopia under Alula in the northern part of Ethiopia to have have the victory over Italians. I would also like to echo what Milton said about the education. More than half a century after independence of many of the African countries, the curriculum in most of the educational institutions is still really influenced by the colonial era kind of educational system. And I think it's a wholesale overhauling of our educational system, making it Afrocentric and learning about our own history, our victories, is needed. But when I say that Afrocentric, it does not mean that we're going to glorify simply because it's African. I'm talking about a history that's evidence-based and through rigorous research, as Sheikh Anta Diop and Nana William Henry Clark have actually set for us in our generation. So I think educating the young is critical if we are to free ourselves completely, because freeing our mind from colonial mindset is still a battle that has to be won. With that, I think I would stop here, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me and for having me here. So thanks to the International Academy for mutual cooperation and for this already really inspiring talks and input by Professor Nurhussein and Professor Allimadi. And so I will just kind of continue on this path of what is the significance of Adwa. But what I try to do today for this talk is to kind of look at the regional or the geography of Adwa and what we can learn if we kind of disentangle Adwa within its different histories. One that relates Adwa to Tigray, one that relates Adwa to Asmara, and one that relates Adwa as it is seen from Addis, and then one as a site of Blackness and liberation and unity. Yeah, so let me just jump in. And as we know, we won't talk about, how the victory of Adwa turned Ethiopia into this symbol of freedom and Black sovereignty for Ethiopians, people across the African diaspora, and in general became this really powerful engine for oppressed people across the globe, and more specifically for a Pan-Africanist movement. And as Milton already highlighted, there is also a really important gender component to this as well that has maybe not really been addressed as much as it should be. And so, but what it also did is kind of it allowed to think about Blackness or Black lives outside of the specter of total violence and slavery. But I also kind of really want to depart today, at least, from this interpretation of Blackness and Black empire that originates from Ethiopia throughout the diaspora, but really kind of want to attend to the magnitude of the signification of Adwa, right? In order to become this really important symbol, it really needed to be abstracted. And I want to talk about the abstraction that took place in the making of Adwa and that is taking place, and how it's conjured with an erasure of difference or different historical geographies. And I want to think about Adwa almost as this kind of double bind that seemingly has one message, but it actually sometimes also has contradictory messages, right? Or conflicting messages. As Professor Nurhussein has already talked about, how Adwa currently has become really a polarized calling card in some ways for Ethiopians. And so, yeah, Adwa has multiple geographies. It's known as a homestead of the political elite of the TPLF party, as we know it, at least before the war broke out in 2020, which then also spread to the regions of Afar and Amhara. And as we know, the implications of Adwa or the TPLF, the rule of the TPLF party, are really still very reminiscent. Why I'm talking about this is because the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi was from Adwa, as we know. And there was also within Addis Ababa this fantasy almost that Adwa is like this center or capital of deception, of spies, because that reign of power of the TPLF party or the EPRDF party since the 1990s up until Abiy Ahmed's turn has kind of caused a lot of grievance among societies within Ethiopia, a time of surveillance and oppression. So that's one thing that Adwa incorporates, right? It's a historical site for Tigray, where the Marxist-Leninist student movements that were really vibrant and active in the 60s in Addis Ababa, and with the Derg that came into power and toppled the Ethiopian empire in 74, a lot of these student movements had to go back to the villages, right? And so you have Adwa kind of receiving all these students, right, that are kind of pushed out of the city center and aligning themselves with the peasant movements and forming a TPLF party. So then we see actually that that region is embedded within Tembien, a region that incorporates yet another history, right? Adwa within that kind of TPLF history, a center of rebellion, right? So there was before the battle, after the Battle of Adwa, we have the Second Italian War, where this region becomes a really important site as well in 1935 and 1936, where we have the first Battle of Tembien, the second Battle of Tembien, and Italians actually using mustard gas in kind of order to win that battle, which they ultimately win, and it ends up in the occupation of Ethiopia. But what I want to highlight here is that we also see a form of rebellion that is incorporated within that region. At the same time, Adwa later on, after the liberation, becomes also the site of deception and people feeling betrayed by the liberation, right? So we already have here two images on how Adwa becomes something else outside of the battle, the famous Battle of Adwa. It becomes a different geography. But then there's also another line of embeddedness, how we can think about Adwa, right? We can think about Adwa that relates to Asmara and to Eritrea. We have a lot of migrants from Tigray that came, they went to find work to Asmara, into the city. And so there are these kind of trans-regional relationships that later become really fraught, right, between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And we know that with the war that broke out in 1998 up to 2000, where a border war between Eritrea and Ethiopia kind of highlighted the fraughtness of this region as this productive and generative site. And Adwa again becomes this really important generative force, right? While the war is not taking place precisely there, it's yet another town. But then there's also Adwa as a Black site, as a site of Blackness, as a site of unity, right? And let me just highlight here one example that speaks to the power of Adwa for Pan-Africanist movement that is kind of relating back to the famous Battle of Adwa. And it's the period, was the fifth and the last Pan-Africanist Congress, which took place in Manchester in 1945, the Pan-Africanist Congress, right? And it was really important because here we see that the leadership that was previously assumed by left-wing Caribbean and African-American intellectuals was moving toward prominent African leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, who led the independence of Ghana in 1957, Jomo Kenyatta, who led the independence in Kenya in 1963, and South African writer Peter Abrams. And so we see a shift in that Pan-Africanist Congress, right? But there is also the Adwa plays a really instrumental part here as well, because now Pan-African thought was aligning with decolonization movements and the formal end of colonial rule in most African countries and the quest for emancipatory politics of governance. So under the auspice of Afro-Jamaican activist and journalist Marvin Garvey, who was really committed to the Back to Africa movement, the first Pan-African conference in London already set out, you know, this goal of connecting all people of African descent all over the world. And we see when we go back then that Garvey made his travels to London between 1912 and 1914 and made really crucial contacts and fostered connections between activists from the African continent and the Caribbean. And the Pan-Africanist gathering was crucial for Black people in the diaspora to forge connections with their ancestral land. So we see, for example, the Haitian journalist and scholar Benita Sylvian had actually gone to Ethiopia and met Menelik in April 1897, right, to congratulate him on the great victory of Adwa the year before. Their affection and admiration for each other was seemingly mutual, right? And while in Ethiopia, Sylvian spoke on behalf of improving relations between Blacks and the Americans in Africa, and Menelik II supported such ideas, right? So 3 years later, we see the Pan-Africanist Conference where Sylvian actually enlisted himself as representing both Haiti and Ethiopia. And furthermore, during his speech, Sylvian's speech at the conference, he recalled the violent achievement of independence by Haiti and the violent defense of its independence employed by Ethiopia. So here we see Adwa served here as an imaginative force to think about Black sovereignty and of decolonization of the continent. But also we can see that encapsulated a material force and was part of a movement of world making. So as I kind of try to show, we see Adwa symbolizing different histories that are actually much more complex and nuanced, right? And so I think the narrative of defeating European colonization also pushes us to maybe think about something else, right? Because here we see globally, Ethiopia was hailed as an anti-colonial power. It loomed so large in Ethiopia that it overshadowed a reckoning with its own histories of colonization, right? And that's for me kind of important because even in 1962, and I'm close to the end, but I think that's really important. Even in 1962, as Eritrea was annexed by the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, there was no mentioning of colonization and occupation. And so the public discourse within Ethiopia oscillated between Ethiopia's right to do so and one of granting autonomy to Eritrea. For Eritrea, this event of annexation constituted the engine for the emergence of independence movements such as the Eritrean Liberation Front, as well as the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. So my question here is really to kind of think about how we make sense of these existent forms of post-colonialism, legacies of slavery and occupation in Africa, and in particular in Ethiopia, a country that has defied European colonialism, but yet has also enacted its own imperial projects. So we see Adwa exist in these multiple registers as an idea of freedom, a town of spies, at least in that particular period of the EPRDF, a region of rebellion, and also one of erasure. So I suggest to think about how to think about these multiple messages that are incorporated within Adwa, and how that allows us to have a more complex, more complicated picture of what Adwa can actually do to us in understanding Ethiopia's current problems of accounting for difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabine. Now I think we're going to open up the session for questions. I will raise some questions here, and as I raise those questions, please feel free, among the panelists to address the question, unless if the question is directed to a specific individual. I haven't seen any question coming up, and I think I'm going to ask my own question to the panelists. You may just answer that as you see fit. Given, of course, there is this complexity and nuanceness when we talk about Adwa and what it means. But being at this time just asking the significance of that question, given the situation of Africa today, what does it mean? What lesson can we get from that victory and the pride that came out of it? Milton.
Well, I think we can get multiple lessons and benefit from the victory at multiple levels. Continentally, if I was a representative of the Ethiopian state, if I come to a setting like the African Union Conference, for example, I would stress the importance of teaching that history in other African countries, just as it's important to teach of the victory of the Mahdis over General Gordon, the victories of Samori Touré over the French over several decades, and the victories that we discussed in South Africa by the Zulus. That's a benefit for all Africans. And then, of course, the internal contradictions. That would also be a lesson to draw from Adwa. And as Professor Sabine has indicated, it's a multi-layered and multifaceted narrative. So of course, you would address the contradictions as well. I think the main problem for me is that the leadership in most African countries don't take the importance of history the way that they actually should. And that to me is a major problem. I was talking to some of my Nigerian friends a few years ago, and they were telling me that there was a debate in Nigeria about whether there's any need to be teaching history or African history. That because Nigerians want to evolve into a modern state, so maybe they could be focusing on the sciences and technology and do away with history altogether. But then if you look at countries, if you look at China, if you look at Japan, if you look at the United States, if you look at Britain, all the countries that have industrialized and have created advanced economies, they emphasize their history to the extent that they actually wipe out other people's history, particularly people that have been conquered, particularly people that are still exploited in our contemporary era. I think that in order for Africans to understand our position in the global system, the global economic system, they first have to understand that it was not always like that, you know? Sadly, many Africans look at our contemporary economic conditions and they think it sort of confirms our deficiencies as a people, not understanding that the deficiencies that we see are a result of our history and the phases that we went through. My students at John Jay, even the ones who come from African countries, are completely stunned when they learned about the teachings of Int'l. You know, they have it vaguely in their mind that yes, human beings, originated in Africa, but they don't know of the achievements that they actually had before even before any of these European countries existed. So to me, it goes back to the importance of history, and in the context of clashes between conquering imperial power coming from outside, I think Adwa to me is very significant and remains significant in that context. Thank you.
Who else wants to jump in? Sabine Mohamed.
Yeah, I think Milton really already talked about this in some ways, right? That there is no clear true line in some ways, right? It is absolutely important to talk about the Battle of Adwa, because on one hand, it really kind of was the engine for a Pan-Africanist movement to really kind of start thinking and pointing towards examples in the world that have achieved sovereignty and that have defeated European Inquisition and conquests, such as, Ethiopia, Sierra Leone has its own history, Haiti. And so I think there is something to be said about that magnificent force that Adwa kind of incorporates. And at the same time, for me, it's always interesting because working on Addis, I see that there's also a different history that is a very local history, right? That's a local history of rivalry. That's a history that's really complex. And, that on one hand, one could see Adwa as this moment where Black Empire comes true, right? On the other hand, Ethiopia has also annexed Eritrea, right? And it has also built Addis Ababa, which meant a displacement of all the people that have lived there. It has conquered all the land below Addis, the capital city, as a result of the victory of Adwa, right? Because then now Ethiopia enters this world stage as an empire itself, as an imperial power, which also has its own histories of violence and erasure. Now, so I think there's so many important lessons to be learned, right? In ways of how do we think about Black Empire within Ethiopia as this idea and force that contributed to ideas to liberation movements of thinking about self-determination. At the same time, Ethiopia has kind of occupied and colonized parts of its own population, which is now part of Ethiopia and has caused for problems, but also Eritrea as this kind of, Eritreans probably would say their movement, their struggle for independence was against Ethiopia as the Black power, right? and so I think it's really important to think about all these different histories that this battle occupies.
Let me push you a little bit, Sabina, before I go to Mohammed, especially on some of the lessons, perhaps some of the what would you say, some negative spin-off from the Adwa. That's what I understand is now, Ethiopia, as then Abyssinia begins to conquer her own people within. We are seeing here where we are talking about Adwa as the time when Ethiopia transcended ethnic, religious, cultural confines and united to defeat Italy, of course, giving them a traumatic experience. And yet there is this dark part of it, which you are pointing to us. Can you expand on that? I mean, of course, Ethiopia is going down, and you have the Oromo situation, you have the southern part, and you are having that situation. You are making mention of some of those. So how could that be addressed? How can Ethiopia correct those say mistakes? Let me use the word mistake for a lack of a better word.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I would be really interested also to hear Professor Mohamed and Professor Milton's take on this. But in my perspective, I think the Battle of Adwa really achieved something that transcended right into the world. Within Ethiopia, the idea of Ethiopia also kind of emerged through this Battle of Adwa, right? Before that, we don't have a stable a capital. That's, I think, also really important. Addis Ababa is the first capital that's fixed in one geography. Beforehand, we have like all these the era of princes, and so within that kind of feudal empire, I think even understandings of sovereignty are really different and very, very interesting, I think, to study, because they kind of go against ideas on how we think about the nation state. But let me say, I think with the Battle of Adwa and with Addis Ababa really becoming the capital of what we now know as Ethiopia, Ethiopia is also another word for Amhara, right? So there is an understanding that, for example, in this very heterogeneous country, that there's one language and there is one line that has actually now succeeded, right? And so I think one of the criticisms that really come up in 2005 during the election and 2016 is that there is a homogeneity, an understanding of a homogeneous Ethiopia that is mostly an Amhara idea of nobility, etc., which has actually excluded the diversity that is present within the country. And so we see actually already in the student movements in the 60s that people are thinking about self-determination within Marxist-Leninist ideas, but also how to incorporate difference and the recognition of other peoples. And so that kind of gets thrown out. And I think one idea one solution to it, right, to kind of was actually brought forward by this new EPRDF multi-ethnic government that said, now we have to just recognize difference linguistically, ethnically, but in ethnic terms. But that was really then translated and really a fraught concept, because people felt that it was more a divide and rule answer to and kind of a tearing apart of the idea of Ethiopia as this powerhouse. So I think if you push more, right? So I think the lessons are, how can we think about Ethiopia that on one hand is not going this route of assimilation, right? A force like that unity is just achievable through like a homogeneous point of historical departure, but also doesn't inscribe recognition only through the lines of ethnicity, right? So there needs to be something else that unites. And I think the Battle of Adwa was maybe something, you know, in a broader sense, that was uniting people in terms of not wanting to be colonized by Italy. But yeah, I think for me, most of it, the Battle of Adwa has always been fraught, especially when I did my research, that people felt very felt a pride of that history, but also had a difficulty to reckon that Adwa was situated within Tigray, a country that actually has, in their eyes, divided the country into ethnic sovereign regional states. I know that's not the answer you're looking for, but I think it is actually to allow for different forms of recognition to emerge that are not kind of derived through like a very simplistic understanding of ethnicity, but takes really serious the struggles for self-determination. What does that mean to have sovereignty?
Well, thank you so much, Sabine. I think we'll go to Mohammed and to hear what his views are on this. We'll come back, we'll cycle back and just ask some of this fascinating.
Thank you. I will just start from where Sabine left off about how to look at the Battle of Adwa. She has beautifully explained the ethnic tensions within the entity that's called Ethiopia, and the fact that the narrative of Ethiopia has been that of the dominating ethnic group ever since the Solomonic dynasty started, and that narrative has been what has been sold to the rest of the world, what Ethiopia represents. And now the debate about Ethiopia and Ethiopianness is really around that aspect. I think we need to learn our own history for Ethiopians, Ethiopian history, warts and all, recognizing there were bad actors, recognizing there were crimes committed in many areas, crimes against humanity. I think that understanding the diversity of the country with several ethnic groups, nationalities, nations, nationalities, some of them their own kingdoms before they were incorporated to the current day Ethiopian state under Menelik. So I think knowing our diversity and that diversity could be our strength, in fact should be our strength, as was shown by the fact all these, even the marginalized ethnic groups came to defend Ethiopia, refusing to be colonized. That's why I consider the Battle of Adwa really the victory of Ethiopian people. Unfortunately, the history has been sold as mainly the glorification of the ruling class having won victory at Adwa. So that's for Ethiopians to work that out within themselves. And that goes on the wider continent. But the significance of Adwa for me is the fact that the victory of Ethiopians, a country of Black people, actually dealt a crushing blow against white colonizing power, thereby really sort of providing a crushing defeat to the white supremacist theory of the whites being the superior race. They were defeated by Africans. The other significance that I see of Ethiopia is that's actually related to what I just said, is the fact that it was a spark for really igniting the Pan-African movement, because the victory had reverberations in the global African world, whether in Africa or the Caribbean and the United States. Obviously, I think it was Milton or somebody mentioned earlier to the fact that out of that victory of Adwa came the idea of the first African Congress in 1901, which started talking about ways to liberate the colonized countries in Africa and the Caribbean, and also the civil rights movement in Ethiopia. So its significance is far and wide. I want to go back to that education part of it because it's key. Even now, as we raise a new generation of Africans, I think they need to learn the victories, but also the other things like we mentioned in Ethiopia, some of the bad things that have happened. But it will be properly researched and evidence-based history of Africa, when you discarding the colonial inspired kind of curriculum that still goes on to this day.
Thank you very much. I note that Professor Nzongola-Ntalaja is around here. Actually, we had. So I will invite you to do your contribution.
Anyway, I listened to all of the presentations, which were very, very informative. My presentation is going to focus my attention on the insights and lessons that we Africans can learn from this battle of March 1, 1896, and what post-colonial Africa can learn from the second aggression of Italy against Ethiopia, namely the occupation of the latter by fascist Italy under Mussolini between 1935 and 1941. Insights and lessons from Adwa. The Battle of Adwa is a remarkable historical event and one that the Ethiopian filmmaker Haile Gerima has immortalized in an outstanding documentary drama entitled Adwa, an African Victory. What are the major lessons learned from this victory? The first point, and most important for me, was the strength and stability of the state. Unlike most of the African pre-colonial states that were conquered by the colonial powers, Ethiopia was a relatively strong and stable state that traced its origins to biblical times. The belief in its creation through King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba played a major role in strengthening the state through the closeness to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, whose priests wrote the history of both the crown and the church, thus creating an ideological ground on which the obedience of the people to the state was based. Second, and related to the first point, is the unity of the people. Now, this is the point that most of the speakers here did talk about, the unity of the people of Ethiopia. Despite its feudal structure, Ethiopia was able to maintain its unity during its confrontation with Italy. The feudal rulers of the various regions of the country followed Emperor Menelik II and Empress Taytu in the resistance against Italian conquest. This unity and the commitment of both lords and peasants to the war against the invaders was crucial to the victory over Italy. Third, the victory at Adwa was due in large part to the involvement of both men and women in the struggle, together with the brilliant strategic and tactical skills of Emperor Menelik and Empress Taytu. The latter played a key role in the victory by depriving Italian troops access to drinking water during the siege of Menelik before the Great Battle at Adwa. Founder of Addis Ababa, Taytu played a major role in imperial decisions, and she was one of the top commanders at the Battle of Adwa. She mobilized a large number of women on the battlefield to encourage men involved in combat and to give them logistical support. Fourth was the parity or close parity in the arsenal of war, as the Ethiopians had the same modern weapons as the Italians, which Ethiopia, then also known as Abyssinia, had obtained from Russia and France. This was a major factor in ensuring the survival of African sovereignty in this land. With this victory, Menelik consolidated his place in history as the founder of modern Ethiopia. Here, it is important to emphasize the fact that Europeans were not able to defeat all other African uprisings simply on account of superiority in modern weapons, or the fact that they owned cannons and machine guns. The full repertoire of what some historians call the tools of empire included superiority in technology and resources such as medicines, steamships, railways, telegraphs, and the organizational capabilities of the industrial state. End of quote from the historians Parker and Rathbone, African History, a very short introduction. Two other factors in Africa, in the African defeat were, one, the large number of states and societies without states, which were difficult to organize in a common struggle against European conquest, and two, the recruitment of soldiers of Africans who had been enslaved in some African states. These formerly enslaved Africans knew many of the weaknesses of their former masters and the institutions under their control. Second point, the invasion of Ethiopia by fascist Italy, 1935-1941. Italy's 1896 defeat in Ethiopia was greatly felt as humiliation, and only for that, not only for being denied access to Ethiopia's economic and strategic assets, but also for the white country to be defeated by a black one. Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist dictator, could not rest until he could avenge the humiliation of 1896. With large armies in his neighboring colonies of Eritrea and Italian Somalia, Mussolini had no great difficulty invading Ethiopia on October the 3rd, 1935, with 30,000 troops, 1,000 trucks, and large supplies of mustard gas. In his book, The Manufacturing of Hate, Milton Allimadi writes that in the face of aerial bombardments with poisonous gas, flamethrowers, and concentration camps meant for Ethiopians, to exterminate Ethiopians, the New York Times of May 6, 1936, uploaded Mussolini's show of force with 50 planes flying over Addis Ababa, the Ethiopian capital, and of course, forcing the Emperor Haile Selassie to leave the capital and go into exile. Despite these heinous war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of genocide committed by the Italians in Ethiopia, France and Germany saw no problem in the Italian reign of terror in Ethiopia and did not encourage the League of Nations to punish Italy for its crimes. It is only when Mussolini became a very close ally of the Nazi leader Adolf Hitler that the Western allies asked the British, who already had the colonies of Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, British Somaliland, and Kenya next to Ethiopia, plus other colonies in East and Southern Africa, to expel the Italians from Ethiopia. The British brought soldiers from home and from their African colonies, including Nigeria and Southern Rhodesia or Zimbabwe today. They also solicited and obtained soldiers from my country, then the Belgian Congo, which was then maintaining the Belgian government in exile in London to the tune of 40 million pounds sterling. There were also some men of African descent from the United States and from the Caribbean who joined Ethiopian soldiers and volunteers in fighting against the Italians. Of the African troops, those from the Belgian Congo scored 3 major victories on the Italians, which destroyed the capacity of the latter to sustain their control of Ethiopia. These victories were won by the Congolese as follows: March 11, 1941 at Asosa, March 23 at Gambela, and July 3 at Sayo, which is now known as Dembi Dolo. Here, 9 Italian generals, 1 colonel, 370 officers, 2,574 Italian non-commissioned officers and soldiers, and 1,533 Eritrean non-commissioned officers and soldiers surrendered to the Force Publique, or the name of the colonial army in the Congo. Thus, if the Battle of Gondar under British command in November 1941 was the ultimate defeat of Italy in Ethiopia, its capitulation to the Belgian Congo at Sayo had been a very, very important blow to the Italians. More than 500 Congolese died or gave up their lives during the Abyssinian campaign, including 245 soldiers, of which 42 were killed on the battlefield and 195 due to gun wounds or disease, and 274 porters. As you know, some of these soldiers went to Ethiopia on foot, and others, of course, using motorcycles or trucks, which was a very long trip to go from the Congo to Ethiopia. As a Congolese nationalist, I went on pilgrimage to all of these 3 battlefields in August of 2014. This was 20 years after I had been to Adwa to look at the big battle. I was greatly disappointed, but there is no single marker of what happened at these sites in honor of the men who fell and gave their life for freedom and national sovereignty. In conclusion, I am pleased to say that the sacrifice our compatriots paid in Ethiopia has been reciprocated by the Ethiopians, albeit on a smaller scale, by Ethiopian soldiers who died fighting to end the secession of the mineral-rich Katanga province of the Congo in 1962-63. This is a kind of solidarity African countries must practice in fighting all predators and terrorists, internal or external, working in support of the enemies of the African people and different forces and ideologies which are against the best interests of and for the peace and prosperity goals of African peoples. The struggle continues. Thank you for your kind attention.
Oh, thank you very much, Judge, for your presentation. I think we have one question. So we have one question in the chat which came in before the judges presented. And the question is, there is a preface which simply says there is interest in this presentation. And then the question follows, which is Adwa the victory of all Africa or only for Ethiopia? So I think the question is directed to all 3 or 4 of you. You can just take turns in it.
My quick answer is for all of Africa. I think we've made that clear in our individual presentation.
Perhaps you may want to push it a little bit to say why you think that way. I think the person who asked the question would.
Well, as I indicated, in my mind, and I find that even the generation that comes after me, younger Africans, increasingly see themselves as Africans, and they see less and less meaning in those borders that they and their ancestors had no part in really drawing. So I'm hopeful that in the end, when the history of Africa is told, it will be told as the history of Africa, rather than the history of Uganda, the history of Congo, history of Ethiopia, history of Somalia, the history of Kenya. I see ourselves as an African people. I follow social media, and I'm very encouraged and heartened when I see the conversations that young, conscious Africans are involved in. They don't seem to carry the burdens of my generation and the generation that came before me, that seem to be more vested in the narrative of Africa that was shaped by the conquerors of Africa. So that is why, to me, I see no problem in seeing the Battle of Adwa as an African victory, the Battle of Nsandwana in South Africa as an African victory, the victory in Khartoum, Omdurman, as an African victory, all the victories by Samori Toure as an African victory. In fact, Samori Toure was trying to build alliances with the Asante so that they could fight their common enemies together. That alliance did not materialize, and ultimately, Samori was, of course, captured. So as a Pan-African, it's very easy for me to claim Adwa as an African victory.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yes, Sabine?
Oh, okay. I think I would like to rephrase the question along with what Dr. Mohamed has said when he was kind of pointing to, when he was basically asking us to see Ethiopians, or the diversity of Ethiopians, or the people that occupied that land at that time and fought and went and walked from Addis to Adwa in order to be part of this battle, rather than like having state-centric vision of it, because then it gets sometimes complicated, because I think the people have done something, that mobilized and fought against colonization by European invading forces. But at the same time, that empire also needs to have, to undergo some form of critical reflection, right? Because it also became a power to occupy different territories. The people that went and fought for the battle maybe saw themselves later on taking away their own kind of forms of will or sovereignty. So I think it's complicated, right? Especially if you look at how it's very difficult to think about different. Yeah, so I think if we have a state-centric or like a leader-oriented vision of it, then it always becomes very fast complicated, because there's a lot of violence and erasure that becomes part of it. Milton has described that in his book, where he kind of says there is a gendered form of misrecognition of the things that maybe, for example, Taytu has done, right? So I think, yeah, I guess I would rephrase it for the people, and then there would be a question mark as well.
I think, judges, yes.
What the other said, the fact is that the word Ethiopia itself came from the Greeks, Ethiops, as the dark skin. And the fact is that at one point within the Pan-African movement, Ethiopia became the symbol of Black people. There were people who wrote books about Ethiopia. When they said that Ethiopia, they meant Africa. And we saw this in the era of the Italian occupation of 35 to 41. But many people from the Caribbean, from the United States, Black Africans, African Americans, were all eager to go to Ethiopia to fight. Some didn't make it. As a matter of fact, one of my colleagues at Howard University, where I spent 19 years, his father had gone to Ethiopia to fight on the Ethiopian side. And that's how he was born in Ethiopia. So we have this, Ethiopia became really the symbol of independence, the symbol of African self-determination. And this is why many of us get really scared when Ethiopians are fighting each other. We would hope to see that this country is really united. It's a country where people stay together because they have a lot to teach us, the rest of Africa.
Anyone else who wants to speak to this? Mohammed, did you have anything to say to speak to this question?
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of things. I think that there are points well made by Professor George that Ethiopia was a stand-in for being Black or for African, ancient Greeks, but that's not where I want to dwell, because it was definitely a victory for Ethiopia, but its symbolism for the whole rest of Africa is such that it was also a victory for Africa. And for those of us who grew up in the age of the liberation struggles, the victory of Frelimo, or the victory of the freedom fighters in Guinea-Bissau or Algeria, they were all victories for Africa. They were ours. We embraced them. So is that way I see that the Adwa represents a victory for all Africa.
Thank you. I was wondering, perhaps when you answer this, Milton, let me just prime the person who asked this question, if they will have a follow-up question to this, to you then, Milton.
I just wanted to also address briefly some of the internal contradictions, and Professor Sabine spoke about that. In Uganda, we had that internal contradiction as well. We have the Kingdom of Buganda, which gained preferential treatment during British colonial rule. In fact, many parts of Uganda saw Buganda as collaborators with the British, and that the British actually used Buganda to guide them into how to subdue other parts of what became Uganda and other kingdoms that existed, like Bunyoro. And in fact, as the country moved toward formal independence from Britain in 1962, the Buganda monarchy, the king and his followers, the court, were reluctant, and they would actually prefer to delay the end of colonialism, because they feared that they would be absorbed and they would assume a secondary status in the new nation state of Uganda, which would have a system of government that was formed after national elections of political parties. And so that is some of the contradictions that we face in Uganda. But at the end of the day, even people of Buganda ultimately were happy that colonial rule came to an end. And obviously, we've always had that tension between, should we have a centralized government in Uganda, or should it be more of a federal system? And it contributed to some of the contradictions and some of the political turmoil that Uganda has witnessed since independence in 1962. So I just wanted to point that out as somewhat, but not entirely similar to some of the contradictions that Ethiopia faces, and the contradictions that many African countries also face, by the way. And of course, as I indicated earlier, my hope is that the younger generation see that they will gain more from unity than regionalism, or maybe a more local vision. Is my hope. My hope is that they see the benefits of increasingly the meaningless of those borders, and those borders serving as barriers to our ability to mobilize effective resistance against our dependent and dominated position in the global system.
Sabine, if you have something, I mean, just a minute to, did you have, I think perhaps if you would simply say that in your conclusion, because it looks like although of course we started a little bit late. So I think we are going to do some rounds here of conclusions, and we are going to give each panelist 2 minutes to just sum up either concluding their thoughts or something for us to think about. Starting with you, Milton, and then we'll go down the line.
Well, I'll keep mine just a minute. I think as a Pan-African, I go back to what I indicated earlier. The Battle of Adwa was a blow against European imperialism, against white supremacy, considering that they really believed General Oreste Baratieri, the commander-in-chief, when he claimed he would return to Rome with the emperor and the empress in a cage so that they could be displayed in the zoo, they were taught a very rough lesson. So I yield my additional 1 minute to Ambassador Nzongola-Ntalaja, because he came in late. So maybe you can give him 3 minutes.
Okay. Okay, who is next? We follow the same line as we did, and then we'll end up with judges. Mohammed, what are your closing thoughts?
I think I echo Milton in that regard. But I do feel the Battle of Adwa needs to be commemorated by establishing really a Pan-African study of the battle itself, and also of African studies. And there was a great idea. The best way to commemorate Adwa would be to establish a Pan-African university to look into this and our history. I think we need something like the people's history of Africa, similar to Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. And instead of it being, centered around the, emperors and the nobility, the people that did much of the heavy lifting in the liberation of these countries need to be recognized and adequately studied. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then, George?
I think that I would like the idea proposed by Dr. Mohamed of a Pan-African university to do studies on these important events in our history, like the Battle of Adwa. I think I heard people mention the Samori of Guinea. People mentioned the Mahdi of Sudan. We mentioned the king of the Zulu in South Africa, and so on. We do have these, and also we have women who really were very, very important. The Yantwe of Ghana, who led the struggle of the people of Ghana to save the golden seed of the Ghanaian royalty. And I think that we can also the people in Southern Africa, such as the lead woman in Zimbabwe, was really one of the persons who gathered people together to fight the British in Zimbabwe in the 1880s. I think that we have a very, very big trove of wealth of documents and of histories, but we can put together so that the people in the next generations would have a better view of how our people defended themselves against European colonialism. And as of course, we eventually were able to overcome it and become independent.
Thank you so very much. I think we really enjoyed Time is Our Worst Enemy. This was a spirited kind of discussion, and hopefully it is to be continued. And I think the lessons which we're getting out of here is just unity and respect for multi-ethnicity. And we have to recognize that even if we had this victory, it's nuanced, complex, and we still have to study it. But above all, it taught us just like the person who led it, Menelik was, I think we should not forget that he really didn't want to go to war. He wanted to settle these things peacefully. And it was when he was pushed to the corner that he had to fight. But he was an astute negotiator, a person who had some good thinking. As we part, I think we have Adwa in our minds. We have to think about what is happening. Internal war that is happening actually in Ethiopia itself, Somalia, Central African Republic, the DRC, and some of these other things. And then perhaps we have to remind ourselves of this, the Battle of Adwa and what its practical implications are beyond perhaps theorizing about it. I want to end up with these words which were said by Martin Luther King Jr. during the civil struggle movements. He said something like this. I think we can take this with us, and I'm summarizing it perhaps purely here. We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately. We must learn to live together as, and then I substitute Africans because it's as Africans, that's my own word, or we are going to perish together as fools. I think I want to end with those words and thank our panelists and thank everybody who participated and also our participants. So we can give ourselves a round of applause. Thank you.